Okay, then we'll go ahead and get into it. I'm going to attempt to keep this lecture to about an hour so that we have plenty of time for additional questions at the end. But I just want to, one of the things that I really like to do with my programming is I find sometimes I go and I see presentations and I look at some of the plant materials that are presented in this presentations and go, wow, that is a beautiful garden. And what an amazing job they did with that. But I can tell that that garden is not here in Utah. And so I really like to highlight and showcase local great examples of gardens that are located here, so you can see what the potential is right here, right where we live. And so this first slide picture is actually it's an older picture. It's taken many years ago, but it is a picture of the garden at the Salt Lake County Jail horticulture program. And they do so many amazing things with that garden. Not only is it beautiful and extremely productive, but they're really utilizing a lot of the tips and tricks that we're going to talk about tonight to help to manage some of their pest problems, to manage their weeds, to manage their water, their soil health, all of those different components. And so this is the type of ecosystem, this is the type of garden that we're maybe striving to try to accomplish. One of the things I want you to notice about this picture is all the flowers that are located in this garden. And certainly they're beautiful. They can be used for cut flowers or for sachets, things like that to bring into the house. But those are the types of elements that sometimes can help us to control pests. We're going to talk a little bit more about this, but help to bring in beneficial insects and natural enemies. We'll talk about those a little bit later to keep pest populations at a tolerable threshold. They also make the garden a much more confusing place. Our insect pests that tend to attack a lot of our fruits and vegetables, they usually have preferred hosts. They have preferred types of plants that they want to attack. And the more difficult you can make it for those pest insects to find their favorite food, the better the likelihood that they're going to get picked off by a predator on their way trying to find it, or that they're never even going to find it at all. So one of the things I'm going to really kind of keep hitting home with tonight's lecture is that we encourage that you plant, to be a successful organic gardener, that you plant a diverse garden. You plant a lot of different types of plants, and included in that plant palette are going to be things like flowers, things like herbs, maybe cover crops, different types of vegetables that are in different families. We'll talk about families a little bit later on. And that you're rotating these different types of plants throughout your garden in different years that you're growing it. You're not growing the same things in the same spot every year. And those are some of the things that are really going to help you to be successful as an organic gardener. So hopefully we'll come back to this slide. And if we have time at the end, I'd like to talk about it a little bit more, but let's go ahead and move into the other things we're going to be talking tonight. Now, hopefully I can advance. Let's see. All right, here we go. Benefits of an edible garden. Better tasting fruits and vegetables. And you let things vine ripen on plants, or plant ripen, you do get that complexity of flavor. In fact, it also is a more nutritious. There are a lot of biochemical reactions that occur during the maturation process of that fruit ripening on the plant, and so you get the more complex flavor, you get more nutritious fruits and vegetables. Cost savings at the grocery, or for those of us that are interested in preserving, oftentimes we want bounty so that we have enough that we can preserve it. This is a big one for me. You can grow hard to find ingredients. You're very limited in your selection sometimes of what you're going to find in terms of variety at, standard grocery stores. Sometimes there's a little bit more diversity at farmers markets and places like that. But if you really want to grow hard to find ingredients, sometimes growing it yourself is the way to go. Lowering your carbon footprints, knowledge of the growing conditions. I find this is a big one. A lot of people like to know what goes on to their food. Educational opportunity, get the family engaged. Kids love to garden, and kids that are out in the garden that can pull off a raspberry from a raspberry bush and pop it in their mouth right out there. They tend to be really interested in what it is that they're eating. It's a great way to expose them to new foods. Exercise and stress relief, and interest. This is the big one for me, interest in the natural world. Sometimes for some people, there's a spiritual experience involved in that. I grow plants. I'm a horticulturalist because I like to see what comes to my plants. I'm interested in the plants, but I love to see all the insects and all the other sorts of critters and things in the garden that come and visit those plants because I have created that ecosystem for them. So what does it mean to grow organically? Well, there are some implications for you in terms of weed control. There's a lot of really amazing technology in herbicides that because you're deciding to grow organically, you're kind of taking off of the table. You're choosing not to use those types of products. So you do have to manage weeds other ways, and we'll talk about some of those ways. Same thing with fertilization. You're choosing to purchase and utilize certain types of fertilizers and not others, as well as with soil amendments. Certainly with insect and disease control, same thing with weeds. Insects and diseases, there's a lot of really amazing pesticides and fungicides and those types of products that you're deciding not to use when you choose to grow organically. So again, you have to manage those types of things other ways. I just want to point out that for commercial agriculture, so people that are selling agricultural commodities, there is the USDA certified organic program. This is overseen and administered through the National Organic Program through the United States Department of Agriculture. And there is a website here, www.omri.org. If you're interested in what can and can't and how it can and can't be used on certified organic products, go to this website and it will tell you. It is accessible to you as the public. So if you're interested, okay, in a certified organic system, how can I use neem oil? Under what conditions can I use neem oil? On what? Or if I want to use compost tea, or if I want to spread manure, how can I do that? What are the restrictions that have to be abided by to be approved through the USDA Certified Organic Program? That website will spell all of that out for you, explain that out for you. It's really pretty interesting. I encourage you to check it out. And then last but not least, if you do choose to grow organically, and I find that there's a lot of sometimes people want to just really strictly grow organic produce. Sometimes they're willing to kind of for the most part, use organic techniques, but some things they're willing to give on a little bit. Seeds and starts is one of them. If you are purchasing certified organic seeds, you will see this label on the seed packet. Okay, it's got to be there for it to be a USDA certified organic seed. If it's not there, then you can't assume that is organic. It is sometimes difficult to find organically grown starts unless specified. I would probably assume that it was not, those starts were not raised organically. And so that's, again, another decision and consideration that you have to make when you choose to grow the plant you want to grow. If that is something that's important to you, you may have to really do a little homework and research and finding some sort of a grower who is raising those starts organically, just asking questions, finding out more information about what those growing conditions were and raising those little seedlings. Okay, so why grow organically? Well, one of the cornerstones of organic production, whether it's gardening or agriculture, is a real interest in what's happening with the soil environment. Organic growers really tend to want to build soil fertility, to improve soil quality, soil health from season to season. And of course, as we grow things and we harvest things, we're pulling nutrients, we're pulling some of those things from the soil and harvesting our produce. And so there's a real interest in organic gardening and replenishing those soil nutrients and really helping to maintain a very high level of soil health. Perhaps that is a very diverse and vibrant community of soil microorganisms. All of those different sorts of things are of key interest with a successful organic production. This is a really important one for me. Provide habitat for pollinators and natural enemies. If you are deciding to grow organically because you are pulling so much chemical technology off the table for utilization, it is really important that you utilize everything you can to help you in maintaining your pest pressure. And by pest, I mean weeds, insect pests, and disease pests. So certainly in helping to enhance and improve the soil conditions, that's going to help with some of those things. But natural enemies we have very vibrant communities of them. We're providing good habitat, hunting grounds, food sources for them throughout their different life cycle stages. It's really going to enable us to have a thriving community of those predators and parasitoids that are really going to help us to maintain our pest populations at a reasonable threshold. We will talk more about those, but very, very important. Reduce or eliminate broad spectrum pesticide use. And really you're exercising your gardening preferences too. So those are just a few reasons. I'm sure there are more, but just a few I wanted to point out. Okay, so I'm going to go over the top 10 considerations for growing organically in Utah. And you probably want me to skip straight to pests and all that kind of stuff, but I can't, I really cannot stress enough that you have to have healthy growing conditions to grow healthy plants. And that includes in organic gardening, in organic gardens. And so we need adequate sunlight. All right, so if we're trying to grow in a spot where we're not getting enough sun exposure, we're going to have stressed plants. And when we have stressed plants, that's when we typically have disease and pest populations that start to move their way in. We need to have good knowledge of the soil. We'll talk about this here in a minute. I'll give you the site, but getting your soil tested. Sometimes I have talked to some organic gardeners who feel like soil testing is not something that is really important for them. And actually, it's the furthest thing from the truth. It's extremely important. A soil test provides you a baseline of information, and so you know what you should be adding, what you don't need to add. You sometimes discover problems or issues in the soil that can be rectified. And of course, that's going to help to reduce the amount of stress that your garden plants are facing when they're trying to grow and be productive for you. So soil is very important. Keeping in mind considerations like slope and how water is moving through the soil environment. Weeds are competition for garden plants. Weeds must be maintained. We want to eliminate as much competition as we can. We try to get lots and lots of productivity and lots of growth in a very short period of time out of a lot of our garden plants. Well, our garden plants that are annuals, right? So we really want to make sure that we are not that we're trying to control the weeds so that they're not competition for our plants and for the growing conditions that they need. Good air circulation, not trying to plant plants too closely to one another, or if you have a plant that's kind of hovering over another plant, a garden plant, sometimes we can have air circulation problems or even shading problems that can occur in the garden. And so we really want really good air circulation all around through the plant. Sometimes that can help eliminate some disease pressures that we might see otherwise. And good access to our garden plants. So just a note.
Katie?
Yes.
There's a question that has to do with the slide you were just talking about. Do you recommend soil testing for raised vegetable gardens?
I would recommend it for raised vegetable. Just again, you're getting a baseline, and we'll talk about soil testing a little bit more here in a minute, but just getting a baseline. And I want to go over what you actually test for when you get a test. And I think that will help to answer that question.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yep, you bet. Okay, so in terms of sun exposure, keep in mind fruiting vegetables need 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight. That's direct sunlight. That's not dappled sun. That's direct, okay? So fruiting would be things like tomato, pepper, corn, squash, melon, beets. I realize basil isn't fruiting, but it is one of those herbs that really does like a lot of sun exposure. Foliage vegetables tolerate less than 6 hours of direct sunlight daily, but perform best with ideal sun exposure. So you can get away with a little less sun with these, but they still actually would like as much as those fruiting vegetables if possible. lettuce, spinach, Swiss chard, beet greens, kale, and herbs. And fruit trees really produce best with 8 to 12 hours of direct sun daily. So they take a lot of sun exposure. So it is really important as when you're placing your garden that you're spending time out there. Maybe you're making note of when you start getting direct sun, how long that direct sun exposure lasts, to make sure that you are getting the quantity that you need to have a successful garden. It's absolutely vital. So I just want to show a few growing implications. I showed you the first slide of the Salt Lake County Jail Horticulture Program garden. This is actually what that same space looked like back in April 5th, 2001. And there are a lot of considerations that are going to take place here before we ever really start plopping things in the ground and growing. One thing is we definitely want to get a soil test, and so we'll talk about that in a minute, and we did. And that's actually going to have some management implications for us too. But I also want you to look at the weed pressure here, okay? Obviously, we have some weed pressure here. It probably is important to identify what kinds of weeds we have growing in this area. Are they perennial weeds? Do they have underground spreading structures like rhizomes? Are they annual weeds? Some of those different sorts of things, because we may actually have to do some preparation to just flat out even begin to control the weeds before we're going to have expectations of being able to grow a productive garden in this spot. And so, 2011, I don't know if you can remember back to that. I certainly do, just because of this program and the problems that we had. But we had excessive rainfall through the end of June. And there are a lot of things I can tell about this field site. A lot of people would just give up at this point. Obviously, we have some flooding, drainage problems, those types of things going on. So what that tells me is there's compaction in this field, that there's unlevel ground in this field. So there are some things that we definitely need to consider moving forward to be able to improve our management practices. Okay. Uh-oh, I didn't have my other picture. I want to show you the, okay, here it is. So here is what we're looking at here. Just a mess. The soil did dry out. By the way, we did get a soil test done. It was a sandy clay loam. So we had a significant amount of sand in it. Had it been more of a clay-dominated soil structure, it would have been really risky to try to till it, rototill it that same year, because clay-dominated soils, if you till them, they produce impenetrable clods that are going to last a lifetime. If you are dealing with more of a clay-dominated soil type and you're tilling it for the first time, or really if you're tilling it in general, you probably want to consider doing that in the fall when we tend to have drier soil conditions, because you're not going to get as much compaction and you're going to have less of a likelihood of producing those clods. But it did finally dry out because of the texture, because we had a lot of sand in that soil. We did go ahead and till that. You see there are some clods associated with it, but not too bad. And that's what the field looked like 2 years later. Okay, so I don't want you to give up. Sometimes people look at that and they go, I just have terrible soil, bad soil, I can't grow in it. That's not necessarily true. Okay, this is what we're trying to achieve. So let me go back. So soil testing is very important, and we would recommend a routine test unless you are looking for anything in particular. Sometimes people like to know what their micronutrient levels are. I'd like to know what their organic matter level is, so you can choose other tests to have those tested for as well, but usually a routine is sufficient for what most people are looking for. And that is going to give you your soil texture, which again has implications on how you manage your soil pH. It's going to give you your salinity, which is your soluble salt level in your soil. It's also going to tell you your phosphorus and your potassium levels. It usually does not tell you your nitrogen. Okay, and the reason why it is going to give you your phosphorus and potassium is because those are two nutrients in the soil that are not very mobile in the soil environment. Once they're there, they just kind of stick around there until a plant takes them up and we harvest some sort of a portion of that plant, and now all of a sudden we have obviously moved that nutrient off-site. Okay, so those levels don't fluctuate and change rapidly in the soil environment. Nitrogen does. There's a whole nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen moves with the soil solution. It of course can become gaseous. It can be tied up in organic matter. There's a lot of different ways in which nitrogen can kind of move around the soil environment. So because those levels do fluctuate, and it is the macronutrient that plants uptake through their root system that they tend to need in the greatest quantity, we usually do recommend applying nitrogen. And I'm going to give you a resource of how much and when you should apply it, because it is different for different crops that you're growing or different garden plants that you're growing. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you are purchasing topsoil, we have a nice fact sheet. You would want to get it tested, your topsoil tested, and this tells you what are acceptable, ideal, and unacceptable levels for things. So before you make that purchase, you can kind of vet and figure out if it's a good topsoil for you to be adding to your garden soil. Okay, so that is the site that you go to, usual.usu.edu. Don't frantically worry about writing all of this down. I'm going to show you in a little bit where you can have access to my slides, but that is the site where you can go to get your soil tested. You actually do send your soil up to Logan. I'll give you a little tip. They test it dry, so you can go ahead and let your soil dry out before you send it. It's going to save you a little bit on shipping, so you don't have to send a wet sample. Okay, number 3, organic matter. Healthy soil comes from soil with organic matter. Organic matter is very important. It's the key to improving many soil quality problems, and a lot of the problems that we see associated with soils. Earthworms are an indicator of good soil health. Earthworms are amazing. If you're digging around your garden, you're seeing a lot of earthworms, you're doing things right. You have the right moisture levels in your soil, you have good fertility levels in your soil, and what's cool about them is if you build it, they will come. You provide the right conditions, and earthworms are going to start to populate that. They come in a lot of different ways, but you will see them start to show up. I just want to point out that in a teaspoon of soil, there's literally billions of organisms. It's a very vibrant, very diverse community. You are not trying to control this, okay? There's good fungus, there's bad fungus. There's good bacteria, there's bad bacteria. There's all kinds of stuff going on. But what we really want to promote is a very vibrant system of macro and microorganisms. And that's what's going to help to create those healthy conditions for growing plants. Okay. So I'm just going to quickly go through this. Soil is obviously extremely important in organic gardening, so we do have to spend some time on it. What is it? It's a combination of organic matter, weathered rock, air, water, plant roots, and macro and micro organisms. And of course, we have our sand, silt, and clay, which is our weathered rock. This is the sand, silt, and clay composition is what we call soil texture. We combine this with organic matter, and what happens is that you have your, see if I can show you with my mouse here, you have your macro microorganisms, you have your sand, silt, and clay, you add your organic matter. In that process of that decomposition and just these things moving through the soil environment, sloughing off, it helps to build glues and slimes and things like that. It helps to bind these soil particles together into what we call these aggregates. This is called aggregation. And when you have aggregation, that's when you produce channels. That's when you produce the macro pore spaces that are so important, because macro pore spaces are what help to hold air and water in the soil environment. And plants, of course, need water, but they also need air. So it's very important to have those macro pore spaces present. So this is what we call the formation of soil structure when we see this aggregation like this. And you can see that organic matter is just a very, very important part of the formation of that soil structure. So for example, if you're dealing with a compacted soil, maybe it's a new area that you're trying to garden, it's got a lot of compaction associated with it, you would for sure want to think about adding some organic matter to that system to try to get this soil structure process taking place and aggregation of those soil particles. This is an ideal soil by volume. A lot of people don't realize that actually sand, silt, and clay, so weathered bedrock, makes up about 45% or so of soil. There's a lot of that in there. And then we have, this isn't hummus like you spread on your pita chips, but, or sorry, hummus, but this is humus. And this is decaying or decomposing organic matter moving its way down into the soil environment. Roots that are constantly sloughed off by plants, different macro and microorganisms as well. So these are the types of things that are helping to make up this organic matter fraction. That's actually pretty high. Most native Utah soils are 1% organic matter or less. So we do, as gardeners, need to be adding it. We need to add some in the beginning when we're first trying to rework a new area. We would recommend about 2 to 4 inches for a new area that you're trying to garden. And then annually, you're adding about 1 to 2 inches of organic matter to maintain those levels where you're trying to get them at about this 5%. You definitely can overdo it by adding organic matter. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's one very common mistake that we do see gardeners make. The other half of the soil, remember this is the macropore spaces, is made up of air and water, and ideally it's about an equal split. To give you a tactile kind of representation of what that would look like with the 25% air, 25% water would be like if you had a sponge, you completely submerge that sponge, it's super saturated, completely filled with water. You pull up that sponge, you're just gonna have water dripping off your hands, dripping down your arms. That's super saturated. Now give that sponge kind of a nice light little squeeze like that, put it back in your hand. It may drip a little bit, but it's not dripping much. That's about that 25% air, 25% water. And that is perfect for plant growing conditions. It's actually perfect for compost piles as well. And it's perfect for macro and microorganisms in the soil. And so you're kind of trying to keep the soil right around that level. So if you are watering wet soil, you are leaving your soil in a state where you have like that submerged sponge all the time. And in that particular state, there's really not a whole lot of macropore space available for air to hang out in the soil environment. And that's actually extremely unhealthy for plants and can definitely lend to plant decline or even plant death. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but there is something called the seed-end ratio. I did talk about how you can overdo it sometimes with organic matter, especially if you have a type of organic matter that's really high in carbon, like wood chips, sawdust, some of those types of things. You can have a lot of carbon and not a whole lot of nitrogen in those types of products. And if you add too much at one time, what happens is in the process of decomposing that organic matter, the bacteria in the soil are going to kind of chomp away or going to break down that carbon. But in that process, they take up nitrogen as well. And they really do a nice job of robbing that soil environment for available nitrogen. And so what we see are nitrogen deficiencies in our garden plants. So the way that you get around this, and you'll have a problem with this, is just not adding too much at one time. An annual addition of about 1 to 2 inches of organic matter is plenty, okay? And maybe 2 to 4 inches when you're first trying to garden a new area. You could consider incorporating it in the fall time. You can incorporate it in the spring as well. But again, if you have a soil texture that has a lot of clay in it, you have drier conditions in the fall, and it might be a better time to add it if you're tilling it into your soil because it helps to avoid some of those issues with compaction in those clay clods. Try to get as weed-free a source or well composted as possible. Really use nice soil amendment when you're putting it on your garden soil. If you're using something that wasn't fully composted, you can definitely develop some issues and problems, maybe introducing weed seeds, some of those types of things that will cause you issues. And trying to add things that are low in salts. This isn't just sodium chloride, table salt, but other types of salts as well. Special consideration of animal manures. Animal manures are a wonderful addition to garden soils, but really only add them if they're well composted. Animal manures, some types worse than others, can be kind of high in soluble salts, and so that can present a problem. Okay, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on backyard composting because I want to make sure that we can kind of move forward with the presentation, but just realize that if you do have a compost pile in your backyard, actually, backyard compost, unless you're adding salts to that pile, it tends to be a very low salt, very low salinity source of organic matter, and it can really do a lot of amazing things. So promoting diversity of beneficial soil organisms, optimizing soil pH and overall health of your garden, improves plant pest and disease resistance in some cases, improves the aeration and drainage of heavy clay soils, improves the water holding capacity of sandy soils. So that's really a nice thing that we recommend it for clay soils. We also recommend it for sandy soils. Provides balanced, slow release source of nutrients to plants, reducing the need for fertilizer, not eliminating it, because with organic matter, it is nutrients, or as microorganisms come along and they break down that material in the soil, they do kind of slowly release it. And so if there's a particular time that a plant needs, a good quantity of nitrogen, you would want to still plan on supplying that to that plant via fertilizer. But organic matter can certainly help to kind of provide a nutrient bank in the soil that plants can pull from. Helps soil hold on to nutrients and water long enough for them to use them, and recycles kitchen and yard waste. So a lot of good reasons there. Okay, we already kind of talked a little bit about soil texture. Remember, soil texture is your percent sand, silt, and clay in the soil. And from a management standpoint, we certainly talked about tilling with clay soils with the clods and the compaction, especially saturated clay soils. But there's also implications on how often you have to irrigate and fertilize. It's probably the #1 question that I get is, how often should I water my garden plants? And unfortunately, there's not one answer, especially here in the Salt Lake Valley. It is really dependent on your conditions. It's dependent on, is your garden on the slope? Is it south facing? Is it north facing? What's your soil texture? All those different sorts of considerations go into how often you need to be, what kind of plants are you trying to grow? You need to think about all those things when you try to figure out what's appropriate in terms of irrigation frequency. However, what we do know is that soils that tend to have a lot of clay in them, or fine soil textures, they take a lot longer to get saturated and wet, and then they take a lot longer to dry back out. So what we typically recommend with those types of soils is a very slow, steady, and deep, so long irrigation event, and then not irrigating them as frequently as we would some of our other soil types, because remember, we need to have air working its way back into that soil after we thoroughly soak it and irrigate it, so that we can have that 25% air, 25% water in the macropore spaces in the soil. So slow and deep, and then not as frequent for clay-dominated soils. For sandy soils, we have to irrigate them a lot more frequently because sand doesn't really tend to hold on to water in the soil very well. Organic matter can help us with that, and it can help to retain some of that moisture in the soil a little longer. But we don't need to use as much water for sandy soils, and we need to irrigate them more frequently. So it kind of depends on where you live. We have both those soil textures here in the Salt Lake Valley area. It's actually the same thing with fertilization because clay soils tend to hold on to a lot of nutrients longer. You don't need to fertilize quite as frequently, whereas sand-dominated soil types, you do tend to need to fertilize a little bit more frequently. Plant support and tendency to compact. This is actually clay. This is under a scanning electron microscope of what it looks like. Clay is in sheets or layers. And so you can only imagine that it compacts very easily, where this is actually an image of sand particles. So some differences there in terms of maintenance. And I'm not going to go over this too much, but texture affects the physical properties of soil. There's not a whole lot of available water in sandy soils, whereas we move down to the clay-dominant soils, we tend to see more. But we have great aeration in sand soils. We have to be really careful to let our clay soils dry out in between irrigation events, so that we have good air in the macropore spaces in the soil. Drainage, great drainage in sandy soils, tends to go down towards clay. And then actually I'm going to move Sean over here so I can see compaction. Sandy soils don't compact nearly as easily as our clay-dominated soil types. All right, let's see if it will let me advance. Hopefully. It has so far. Let's see, maybe I can click back on this and then it will let me go. There we go. Okay. So I really can't underscore enough that you do not want soil compaction developing in your garden soils. You really, however big your area is, it could be pathways, or if you have a small area, it could be stepping stones. You absolutely do not step on your garden soil, period. You don't drive on it, you don't step on it. You're very concerned in terms of making sure that you're not contributing through your management techniques compaction to your garden soil. Sometimes if you have bare soil and sprinkler irrigations, the actual impact of water hitting the soil surface can contribute to soil compaction. So that's a consideration as well. And bare uncovered soil is, of course, prone to erosion. So we want to make sure that we're only stepping in places where we feel like compaction is acceptable. We're staying off of our garden beds. Okay, so irrigation. It's going to depend on the plant growth stage. You just have to use a little bit of just, thinking like a plant. When you consider irrigation needs, when a seedling first germinates, it needs frequent irrigation. You cannot let that seedling's root fully dry out or desiccate, or it will lead to the decline as the plant grows and it establishes a larger root system. Then you can get to a frequency where you're irrigating less frequently than you were in the very beginning. So growth stage is very important. Drip versus irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, both can work really well. One thing about sprinkler irrigation is if you do have a lot of moisture that's being deposited on the leaves of some of your vegetables, sometimes that can create conditions that's favorable for certain types of diseases and things like that. But both of those systems can work very well. And in that particular case, we would recommend if you're doing a sprinkler, water irrigating early in the morning and not in the evening. And the reason for that, and this is just again for a vegetable application, the reason for that is because it gives the entire day for those leaves to kind of dry out after that irrigation vent. And culinary versus secondary water use. Oh my goodness. Okay, so culinary is considered to be a clean water source. Of course, it's more expensive in a lot of cases. It is treated water. And so if you're on culinary water and that's what you're using, you're good. You're fine. Secondary water, depending on where that water is coming out of, can pose some issues. Especially, I don't want to pick on Utah Lake, but we do see a lot of problems with Utah Lake and some people that are pulling secondary irrigation water out of the Jordan River. They can be high in salts and soluble salts. Sometimes those, unless there's a filter, sometimes those water sources can carry a lot of weed seed. So we can see some weed seed or weed pressure coming through utilization of those waters. So those are just some considerations. And I'm not saying don't use secondary water, but that's when soil testing is maybe going to really become your ally, that you're going to be able to see if your salt levels, for example, are starting to creep up. You'll be able to recognize that. And so there are just some considerations out of secondary water use. And the other big one that we've been seeing in the last couple of years too is, hopefully we don't see it happen, but if we have toxic algal blooms as well in some of those water bodies, that can pose some issues too in terms of consumption of some of the crops that you're trying to grow. So obviously you're applying your water where you're growing your plants. We'll talk about that in a minute in terms of weed control, but that's going to help with the competition of your plants and outcompeting those weeds. And so your pathways should be dry. They should be very dry. And of course your planting beds and timing that so that you have good saturation of the soil surrounding the root system of the plants that you're planting, but maybe not flooding, moving down into the planting beds, which would give the wet soil conditions where you're going to see a lot of weed seed germination. Okay, cover crops. Cover crops can be utilized in a lot of different ways. We do have a nice fact sheet, cover crops for Utah gardens or something like that. Forget the title actually, but that's a really nice fact sheet if you're interested in more information on cover crops. They can help to build soil fertility. So nutrients in the soil, in particular legumes, things in the bee and pea family, plants in the bean and pea family, have the ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen at the root system, which is just incredible. So it can help to add nitrogen through the growth of those plants. Soil structure helps to lend the buildup of soil structure, and plants are constantly growing and shedding micro hairs on their roots. Kind of like how we have, new skin cells developing all the time, and we have dead ones that are falling off our bodies all the time. Maybe that's not an image you really want to think about, but the sloughing of those secondary and tertiary root hairs in the soil environment helps to really build up organic matter over time. So that's a good thing as well. Weed control, I know you're going to look at this picture and go, yeah, that's not weed control, but I'll show you a picture that is here in just a minute. Erosion control, keeping the soil covered. For some types of cover crops can be a pollen and nectar source for pollinators and beneficial insects, and can also help with crop rotation. And so you really should be rotating your crops or your vegetables in your garden. You shouldn't plant tomatoes in the same area of your garden every year, for example, because that's how you can start to build up some disease and pest pressure on those plants. If you're moving them around, that's a great way that you can avoid some of that pressure. I do realize that a lot of you probably have very small garden areas, and it's very difficult to do a whole lot of rotation, but you need to just kind of do the best you can. But I guess what I'm saying is a cover crop, and there are summer cover crops that you sow in the spring and they grow in the summer. There are also winter cover crops that you sow in the fall, and then they grow in the fall and then they stay put throughout the winter, and then you terminate them in the spring. They are oftentimes a type of a plant that is not even closely related to your garden plants that you're growing. And so it is a way that you can sneak in a crop rotation, if that makes sense. You also want to make sure that you're rotating your vegetables by family. So potatoes are related to tomatoes, are related to tomatillos, are related to ground cherries, just a lot of different members of that family, that solanaceous family. Those all need to be moved out of that same area to a different area of the garden to be effective in terms of rotating those crops. This is buckwheat. This is a summer cover crop. This is weed control. You're not going to have a lot of weed seed germination because of the competition that this buckwheat is presenting. This is also a really nice one because it is a summer blooming cover crop, and it tends to bloom when there's a lot of other stuff not in bloom. So it's blooming in the summer months, and we see a lot of floral in the spring. So this is a great source of pollen and nectar for some of our beneficial insects and pollinators that are coming to visit the garden. Sometimes you'll even see buckwheat honey being sold. Okay, fertilization. And so there are organic fertilizers, although I want to help to let you know a little bit the difference. The ones that can be used in commercial ag, you will find listed on that www.omri.org site. Different garden plants need different amounts and frequencies of fertilizers. And so if you go to our site, garden.usu.edu, we have a link for fruits and nuts, for vegetables and herbs, and then we have a lot of different ones listed and labeled there. And what's really cool about that site is it will give you almost like a recipe for how to properly fertilize these different garden plants. And so, for example, I've got tomatoes memorized. That tomatoes, you fertilize, usually you put a little nitrogen. Now you get your soil test done, see if you need to be adding phosphorus and potassium. If you have plenty there, then you don't need to add those. You could just add nitrogen, but you would add a little bit as you're preparing that bed in that area. And then you do it again at 4 weeks and 8 weeks after you plant those plants in the garden. And then that's it. You're not fertilizing weekly. What may happen if you fertilize weekly is that you'll get big, beautiful, gorgeous tomato plants, but you're not going to get much fruit formation, or maybe not even any fruit forming on those plants. you just get a lot of stem and leaf growth. And so that's not ideal. Obviously, you want the tomatoes to develop. Maybe that's happened to some of the people that are listening today. That's probably what that problem was. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're adding fertilizers at the right quantities, at the right timing. And I love those fact sheets because they're literally like recipes for growing different types of fruits, nuts, vegetables, and herbs in the garden. So if you're having problems with something, that's a really good place to turn first and see if some of those recommendations vary at all from how you've been maintaining those plants, because you may be able to solve your own questions that way. What does an organic fertilizer mean? Well, what it means is that it was obtained from some sort of a natural source. Now, if it is agricultural commodity, if it's some sort of a vegetable or fruit that's being sold by a grower and it's certified organic, then they have to follow the OMRI website in terms of how and when and what they can use. If you're just applying it in your garden, those same restrictions are not intact like they are for commercial ag. If you're concerned about trying to keep your growing conditions as similar to USDA certified as possible, then you do want to look for that label or that brand on a product that you're purchasing. So I want to give you an example, and I'm not knocking this product. It's a wonderful product. But we have milorganite, and if you go to a garden center, you'll see that this is a product that is organic, and it is organic because it's from a natural source. What milorganite is it's treated sewage sludge. Okay, so it's treated human waste, and oftentimes it's used on golf courses and things like that. It's a wonderful fertilizer product, but it may not be something that a lot of gardeners would feel comfortable utilizing in their vegetable garden. Okay, but it would be probably labeled as organic at a nursery or a garden center because it is from a natural source. Okay, you cannot use milorganite in USDA certified production, organic production. So organic fertilizers were derived from once living or natural sources that can be collected or mined, things like blood meal, bone meal, manures, fish emulsion, alfalfa pellets. Mined would be like potash. Sometimes they're a little slow to release nutrients. We have a nice fact sheet selecting and using organic fertilizers. And one of the things I really like about that fact sheet, so if you just did USU, selecting and using organic fertilizers, it would pop right up. I like that fact sheet because it also gives you gives you an idea of the release rate of that particular product that you're using. And so if you're using something where you want to make sure that, as you apply it, the plants can readily take it up pretty quickly and utilize it at certain growth stages, as what might be recommended in some of those fact sheets I had in that previous slide of the different growing fact sheets. Then you would want to use something that had a fairly rapid release. Okay, and there are a lot of differences with organic fertilizers, so that's a nice resource for you. And this is my favorite. So you want to create, I call it refugia. Being able to recognize the good guys, the natural enemies, your beneficial insects in your garden area. This is a picture of a ladybird beetle or ladybug larvae. These guys are voracious eaters of aphids. And so if we see these, then we want to keep them around. We want to keep them in the garden area. They're helping us out a lot. And here are some of the things that you can do. And then I want to talk a little bit about the population cycles as well on these guys, because sometimes people get a little tripped up with that. So one of the things that we can do is just have continuous blooms in the garden. Our natural enemies and beneficial insects are helping us to pick out pests. Garden pests, sometimes at certain stages in their life cycle. So we really want to make sure that we're attracting these guys and that they're sticking around, and so that they're laying their eggs in our gardens. They're using our garden plants as hunting grounds. And so we really want to keep and maintain all the different periods of their life cycle in our garden area, so that we constantly have them to be vigilantes in our garden and help us with our pest problems. And one of the ways you can do that is continuous blooms. So you want to have things blooming in the early spring, early summer, late summer, early fall. If you can get stuff blooming in the late fall, get stuff blooming in the late fall. That's going to help to attract and retain those types of populations. And also a variety of flower shapes and colors. Practice IPM for insect control. We'll look at a resource for that that's absolutely vital here in just a minute. And intercrop things like herbs and flowers and things like that with some of your garden plants. And that's going to help to bring these guys in and get them close to the things that are growing that you're trying to grow for consumption. Also, it diversifies the garden. It makes it a more complicated place for insect pests to find their favorite host. Now, I want to talk a little bit about predator pest populations, because sometimes this throws people off, and ladybird beetles are a perfect example of this. What we oftentimes see, if you almost think about like, let's think about the Savari, you know, the Serengeti and the Impala descend, and there's a huge flock of them, and they're absolutely destroying landscape. And oh no, what are we going to do? Well, what's following right behind them? It's that pride of lions, right? Because that Impala is their food source. We see that sometimes with pest predator life cycles as well, where we'll see a big surge in pest populations, and we get worried, and oh no, we have to do something about this. We need to spray. But a lot of times, if you can just be patient, if you can just hold off a little bit, you'll see soon to follow are the predators that are following this pest. So, you know, recognize those things in your garden spaces and use good decisions in terms of how to proceed forward with management. So floral abundance near fields and gardens. Diverse garden plantings also attract native pollinators and beneficial insects of all kinds of sorts. Oops, sorry. Native plants provide quality sources of pollen and nectar. Also, some of our garden plants, things like blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, will also attract some of these things. And herbs are great too. And you know, plant a diverse flower, vegetable, and herb garden. Okay, pest control, and we can talk about this maybe a little bit more too in the Q&A. But if you're an organic gardener in Utah, I strongly encourage you to check out this site. This is going to help you out a lot. utahpest.usu.edu. There's all kinds of stuff on the site. Fact sheets, pest advisories. They can send you advisories on what we're currently trapping and ways to control those things. And so you can kind of know what's actively happening in your garden. You have to figure everything out on your own. It's a really nice resource. Different types of controls, cultural, mechanical, and biological controls. If there are good organic pesticide options, they will tell you what those are and appropriate timing. They also include conventional chemical control, and so you kind of have to figure out what you're comfortable with in terms of application in your garden space. But there are organic control options listed in those. Lots of pictures and lots of information on integrated pest management. So for pest control, insect pest control, this is absolutely an essential website to check out. It's really going to help you out a lot in terms of navigating what's going on. That's an old picture of the site, but just gives you an idea. I just want to make a quick mention that organic pesticides aren't always safe for bees. Things like pyrethrin and spinosad are both dangerous for bees, but they are approved organic pesticides under certain conditions. So, you know, just because it's labeled organic doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe to be using. Things that are okay to use when not directly applied to bees, so things like non-blooming crops at night, or things like insecticidal soap, horticulture oil, and neem oil. But again, your very best pest control is really having a very vibrant natural enemy beneficial insect population in and around your garden. And that has a lot to do with how you choose to plant what you decide to grow in your garden space. And I just, you know, we hear a lot in terms of like, you know, spray at night because the bees aren't out, but there are a lot of other things out at night too. So if you can avoid spraying, that's really best. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think that you can read it, and I'm going to show you in a minute where you can grab my notes after this lecture has concluded. But these are some of the beneficial insects. This is what they look like in their different life stages. And these are so fun to find in the garden. They really are. This is lacewings. And so this is what the lacewing eggs look like. They're kind of laying on these silken strands. This is the larva here. These are called aphid lions. They are so voracious. They definitely wake up with the hangries. If they don't have a food source right next to them, they actually kind of go after each other and eat each other. So they are really a very, very good predator of aphids. And then this is the adult stage here. And these are some of the flowers and plants that attract lacewings. One of the very best beneficial insects, actually, lacewings. These guys come out at night, so they'll fly towards lights at night. So sometimes you'll see them. There's also a brown one in the adult stage. All right, hold on a second. Here we go. Okay, parasitoid wasps. Parasitoid lay their eggs inside their host, and that egg, as it hatches and develops, it consumes that host. So it's kind of a crazy thing. But these are, again, some of the flowers and plants that will attract these guys. Look at this poor tomato hornworm here. It's just covered in eggs. It's definitely going to become lunch. And so it's pretty grisly and gruel. I like to say, just, be glad you are as big as you are in your garden, or there would be a lot of things that would want to eat you. It'd actually be a very dangerous place to hang out. Ladybird beetles prey on a lot of different types of small pest insects and some of the different plants that attract them. Again, you'll have access to be able to see this again. Mantids are actually not the best beneficial insects, even though they're probably the most widely recognized, because they're absolutely indiscriminate eaters. They will eat anything they can get their raptorial legs on, which can include bees and other pollinators and things like that. But they are just so cool. And again, here are some of the things that will attract them. Okay, weed control options. I think we're going to kind of conclude on weed control, and then I will be able to stick around for some questions, but I know this is something that people have a lot of questions on. You don't have a lot of great organic weed control chemical options. You really need to develop a different weed control management plan. So first, consider your cultural and mechanical control options. These are things like hand pulling weeds. I'll discuss more of these here in a minute. We actually have a couple slides specifically on different weed control options. Good management and healthy plants may reduce the weed population. You need to make sure you target weeds if you can when they're really small before they become a larger problem and present more competition to your garden plants. Organic herbicides are limited. They're non-selective. Typically, they're contact only, meaning they don't move to other plant parts. They only impact the part of the plant that's been made contact with. Oftentimes, they're expensive. Sometimes they're caustic, and they provide very poor control of perennial weeds. So vinegar, clove oil, cinnamon oil, corn gluten meal, boiling water are not, in my opinion, great options for controlling weeds in the organic garden. And of course, anytime you apply anything, you need to make sure that you read the label. So here is what I would recommend, maybe that you would consider. One thing is to target the weed at the vulnerable life stage. And this takes a little bit of education, but you'll get better at this as you move on. Annual weeds have to come back from seed. The mother plant doesn't come back. They only live for one growing season. So if you can avoid those plants setting seeds, then you have reduced your weed pressure the following year. Biennials also rely on seed production. Biennials live for 2 growing seasons. The first year they typically grow prostrate or leaves. Sometimes we call them rosette, close to the ground. It's the second year that they're pushing up their flower and form their seeds. So again, you try to avoid these setting seeds. Perennials can oftentimes spread via seed and other sorts of spreading mechanisms. Sometimes it's roots, underground stems called rhizomes, things like that. So with perennials, we're not just concerned with what's happening above ground, but we also have to try to do something about eliminating that plant below ground as well. So minimize tilling of soils with high weed seed bank or weeds with underground nodes or underground spreading structures. If you know that you have a lot of weed seeds in your garden soil, what happens when you till it is you're going to have weed seeds that are still viable, but they're just placed so far down underneath the soil surface that they don't have the right temperatures. They just don't have the right conditions to germinate. And so when we come along and we till and we disturb that, we can surface some of those viable weed seeds on the surface of the soil, where then they can go ahead and they can germinate and grow. And so you really only want to use tilling if it's working in your favor. Another thing about tilling is if you have underground spreading structures, sometimes it can break up those underground spreading structures into smaller sections, like rhizomes. Rhizomes are underground stem. I think a lot of people are familiar with field bindweed or morning glory. That's a good example of that. They have underground stems called rhizomes, and they can root out of those stems at growing points called nodes. And so if you break up a rhizome into 100 chunks because you come along and you've tilled it, now you've got 100 plants that are emerging from that. And so you want to have some consideration there too. So I'm not saying don't till, but only till if it's working in your benefit. Making sure that when you're purchasing organic matter or soil amendments that they don't have a lot of weed pressure in them. So thoroughly composted is really important. Utilize weed seed mulches when you can. Good luck finding a weed seed free mulch, but you know, whenever you're putting anything down or on your soil, thinking about whether or not there could be a weed pressure that you're developing because of adding that material is really important. This is a really effective tool. This is really helpful with drip irrigation, is only applying water where you're trying to grow your plants. That is going to reduce those conditions that are favorable for weed seed germination. So that can help as well. There is something called a stale seed bed technique, and this is used for soil preparation. Maybe you have an area that has really, really high weed pressure. You can spend an entire season, actually you water it, you care for that area, you're trying to grow those weeds. Basically all of the weed seeds that are viable within the top few inches of the soil, those are going to go ahead and germinate because they've got great conditions for growing. And then you, of course, come along and you destroy them, however it is that you choose to destroy them. That being the case, it helps to reduce your weed seed bank within the top couple inches that weeds are going to germinate well in the soil. But with that, you would not want to come along and till that site or disturb that soil after you did that technique, or basically you've all of your efforts in the stale seed bed technique are null and void at that point in time. Hand pull weeds before or during the flowering stage, especially for annual weeds. And so if you have a lot of weed pressure and you have to kind of prioritize, if you see something in flower, pull it, because after the flower comes seed formation and you don't want that to happen. There's a technique called soil solarization, and sometimes this can be appropriate. And this is where you're getting kind of a nice smooth bed, flat bed. You water it down and then you put down clear plastic. You want to anchor that clear plastic as close to the soil surface as possible. And you leave that plastic in place during the hot summer months. So certainly during July, August, September, the hottest summer months. 3 months is probably what you're going to need to be successful with it. And it will help to cook those weed seeds that are just top few inches down. And again, you wouldn't want to come along and disturb that site after you had done that. But that's hard because you have to leave that plastic down during the growing season, and so it's kind of more of a preparation sort of a thing. And it's not necessarily going to do anything, for example, like the rhizomes that are located several inches down in the soil. It's not going to cook those, and so you may still have some types of some pressure from some types of weeds. Flame burner is you're basically burning the above ground. This is not a flamethrower or anything. This is but you're burning the above ground portions of that weed. It's not going to do anything to kill the roots, and so you have to keep that in mind. But it can help with some early pressure. You want to be careful you're not also getting heat on your garden plants, because you can cook them as well. And then I just have to I know that we're all adults here, but there have been major fires that have been started with people utilizing flame burners. So you have to be really, really careful that you're using them at the appropriate times of year. Usually it's spring, early spring, when you would use a tool like that. And then obviously have water sources around to make sure that if anything did catch on fire, you can put it out quickly. And then cover crops, and we talked about cover crops earlier, can add competition for weeds. So with that, I just want to pop this up. This is maybe something you do want to write down if you're interested. Organicforecast.org, that site that's up on the top. My notes are populated on that site. This is a blog that I maintain. So if you would like to see these notes again, then you can go to that organicforecast.org. You just would hit on this blog right here. And then I just popped those up today. So they should be the first one there, and you'll be able to pull off my notes there. So with that, I'm just going to kind of scroll through some pretty pictures. Excuse me, I've been talking a while. But Sean, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Sounds good. Thanks again for the presentation, Katie. It was great. Let's see here. Scrolling through questions. There's a bunch that came through. There was some about, for instance, let's say you plant tomatoes in a bed one year and you're wanting to do some crop rotations. How many years should you wait before planting a tomato in that same spot again?
Ideally, about 3 to 4 years, but that's not sometimes. Sometimes people can't get away with that in small garden spaces, and I get it. But if you have a large garden bed, then 3 to 4 years would be your rotation cycle.
Sounds good. Let's see. The question is, if I turn the soil thoroughly in a garden bed each year, can I keep planting the same veggie in the same spot year after year and be okay?
So turning the soil isn't necessarily going to reduce your disease and pest pressure. So I would say that if that is the only thing that you can do because you have such a limited garden space, that's certainly something that you could try, but I don't know that that's going to give you the benefit that you're looking for control of pest pressure. The rotation is really more important. If you are really limited in garden space, one thing you can do is just really try to diversify your garden as much as possible. Grow a lot of different types of plants. You don't have to have a tomato plant growing next to a tomato plant. You can have a tomato plant, and then you can have, something completely different. You can have a squash. You can have, things like that that's in a different family. But yeah, I don't know if the turning is going to help so much with the pest pressure. And by the way, before I know we'll have some people drop off here, and that's fine. I hope that you have a wonderful evening. But I did want to just share this. If you have gardening questions, we like photos too. You can email us and email your photos to mastergardener@usu.edu, and we will answer those questions for you. So that's a nice resource for you if you have follow-up questions about other gardening topics.
Sounds good. There's a question about daikon radishes. Are they good cover crops?
Daikon radishes, they can be. Daikon radishes are really interesting. I personally, and John, I don't know if you have, I haven't experimented too much with them. But sometimes people will plant them as a winter cover crop. And they wouldn't really necessarily survive the winter. It's not necessarily an edible crop that you would consider consuming in the springtime, but actually the radishes themselves will kind of start to rot out in the soil, and can provide a nice source of kind of nutrition to some of your garden plants growing the following year. It's something you could experiment with. There have been some research studies that have played around with daikon radish. One thing about daikon radish is that it is just a massive root vegetable. And so it's one of those things, if you're having some issues with compacted soil and stuff, I mean, talk about finding a way to break up that compaction by growing something that just takes up a lot of space in the soil environment. That could be another reason why it might be attractive to play around with those. So.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we've grown it a few times at the conservation garden. It can get massive, surprisingly massive. But yeah, it's good at breaking up the soil, I think. Let's see. Other questions here. What about dealing with like earwigs? They might not actually be earwigs, but earwig type pests in a vegetable garden.
Well, so earwigs are kind of interesting because and again, you really kind of have to understand the pest, you have to understand the habitat, you have to understand the life cycle. And unfortunately, there's just not one for all pests. They're all different. There's so much diversity out there. Earwigs are actually not typically considered a garden pest. They're actually usually considered a beneficial insect, and I'm going to get a lot of eyebrow raises there. Like, did she really just say that? Seriously? But earwigs are nocturnal. They come out and they feed at night. If there's just a few of them in a garden setting, they do a nice job as serving as predators for insect pests. It's when we have the appropriate habitat for them to hang out during the hot, dry temps and weather during the daytime during the hot summer months, that we start to see their populations build to the point where they can become a significant garden pest and can actually defoliate. So they're a little bit like snails and slugs. They need to stay sheltered during the day. So they like things like compost piles, maybe wood piles, some of those types of places that stay cool and wet that they can kind of go and they can hang out in and hide in. And then they come out at night and they feed. So I would say if you're experiencing really heavy earwig feeding, earwig pressure, then I would suggest putting on your detective cat, trying to figure out where it is that they're going during the day and they're hanging out and harboring and residing. And then if you can destroy that, I think you're going to do a lot to suppress that earwig population. We do have a really nice fact sheet on earwigs. There are some things that you can do with corrugated cardboard and things like that, where actually you can provide those nice harboring conditions for them, where they would want to go hang out during the daytime. And so you put those out there purposefully, and then they go into those types of places, and then you destroy them. You get rid of them. And so there are some different things that you can do with earwigs. And Sean, I don't know if you have anything to add, but I think that's what I would say on earwigs.
Yeah, I know that in a previous vegetable garden that I had, I think my wife put out like a tuna can with some oil in it, and they were attracted to that, and they kind of would drown in that. So that seemed to work pretty well. So to control them a little bit. There's some questions about amending soil, specifically in grow boxes. Like, one of the questions is, how do you amend soil when you have perennial plants that are more permanent in a vegetable garden or a garden in general, like with raspberries or strawberries that aren't really annuals that you're going to be pulling up? How do you amend that soil?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess what I would say is, well, it depends by the crop. So again, I really encourage people to go to those fact sheets on the different individual crops, because there are going to be differences in management of those. For example, strawberries, actually your daughter plants, your young plants are the most productive with strawberries. And so it is actually recommended that you kind of come in and destroy your strawberry patch, replant it with younger plants after a certain period of time. And so that would be an obvious time that you would want to come in and amend it when you were kind of regenerating that strawberry bed. I guess the other thing I would say, just kind of more broadly with things like trees and shrubs, a lot of times perennials are pretty good about navigating the soil environment. They grow an extensive root system. They know they're going to have to be they're going to be wanting to live in the garden for many years. And so they do a pretty good job of finding and accessing those things on their own. But mulches, for example, if you were to lay a mulch on the soil surface, that mulch will eventually break down and supply organic matter down into the soil. It's not going to be maybe at the same level as what you would get if you were mixing in or tilling in or incorporating in a compost, like in a vegetable garden planting bed, but that would be a great way that you could maybe help with your perennial plantings over time. I don't know, Sean, if you have anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think the approach that we take is we tend to just put organic material, mulch or compost or whatever it is, just on top of the soil surface for the most part. Not only in our vegetable garden beds, but just through the garden in general, and just kind of let nature take its course on it. And eventually it'll break down pretty good. Another, Katie, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I just got a low bandwidth thing, but as long as you can still hear me, I can hear you. So
I hear you. Yep.
okay. There's a question about handling powdery mildew. Do you have any advice for that?
Powdery mildew on what crop specifically? Because there are some differences.
It doesn't really say. It just says, how do I handle powdery mildew?
I would say one thing is you want to make sure that if you do see powdery mildew developing, and so a lot of times we see it, for example, on pumpkins or squashes or things like that, you would want to make sure that you don't leave those leaves or remnants of those leaves in your vegetable garden. Good sanitation is actually cleaning up your garden really well at the end of the growing season is a really great way to not to have those inoculum there right in that area that you're trying to grow when those conditions arise again, that they can take off. And again, I think this is something you would maybe want to think about in terms of crop rotation. If you had an area that had a lot of powdery mildew pressure, then you maybe want to grow a different type of plant that isn't quite as susceptible to powdery mildew problems in that area the following year, so that you can help to not be carrying on that disease cycle. Powdery mildew is one of those things that it is a stress on the plant, but we still can get productivity out of that plant even with the existence of powdery mildew being on it. So it's not necessarily a game changer. I know we don't like to see it in the garden, but it is one of those things where there can be some, and there are just certain types of plants you grow that chances are you're going to have some powdery mildew that develops. So, yeah.
Yeah, and at least when I think about stuff like this, powdery mildew or other diseases like that, it seems to me that a lot of these things are lessened once you start controlling where water is going and once you start to have good airflow too. Because if you're just throwing water all over the place, I think the chances that you're going to have problems are higher if everything's wet all the time. So
I think that's a great suggestion.
Let's see. And then maybe one last question here.
Okay.
That's about soil testing. With vegetable gardening, how often do you need to test?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm glad somebody asked that question. So it sort of depends on how it is that you're managing and maintaining your garden. If you do something major to it, if you decide you want to get a bunch of amendment and you want to add it in a certain year, then it probably would be, a good idea to go ahead and get your soil tested and just see what those levels are. If you're just kind of status quo gardening and you're having good productivity in your garden and you're year after year, okay, doing kind of the same thing, maybe adding an inch or two of compost, but other than that, not too much different and I'm getting good productivity, then you can maybe think about testing every 2 to 3 years or so. Would totally be fine. If you're experiencing problems, you might want to consider getting a soil test. If you're pulling irrigation water from a secondary water source that you're worried about getting higher levels of salinity from those soluble salts, then that might be something that you want to get an annual soil test to monitor those things. And so it kind of depends on how you're managing your area and what it is that you're doing. But if things are going okay in your garden and you just kind of keep gardening and doing the same thing year after year and you haven't made any major changes, you're not adding a lot of new things to the garden soil, I think every 2 to 3 years is plenty.
Sounds good. All right, I think we'll wrap it up with that.